The right kind of green. Despite what Al Gore probably thinks, he didn't create the green movement. Back in the early 1900s, there were several types of electric cars competing with Henry Ford's gasoline-powered Model Ts, and car companies have been seriously experimenting with hydrogen-based fuels since the 1970s. But while Gore didn't invent the idea of environmental responsibility, he did, along with politicians like George W. Bush, John McCain, and members of the Congressional Progressive Caucus, figure out a way to use it to further his progressive agenda. At first glance, climate change and going green don't seem like issues that relate to the battle playing out for our country's soul. But that's because we often look at them in a vacuum. If you back away and see the forest instead of the individual trees, you quickly realize what's really going on. Leaders who want more government control over our business, economy, and personal lives can't simply snap their fingers and get it. They need a vehicle to take them there. My contention is that climate change is that vehicle. Not surprisingly, the conservation movement came into its own during the Progressive period. The Sierra Club was founded in 1892, and just 20 years later, Theodore Roosevelt proclaimed, "There can be no greater issue than that of conservation in this country." Today we have Al Gore preaching the same gospel to a different audience. But instead of trying to convince adults who may be set in their ways, he smartly appeals to the feelings and instincts of minors. During an inauguration celebration for President Obama, Gore spoke to a group of 13 to 17-year-old honor students. He explained to them that current-day anti-global warming sentiments are a lot like racist sentiments were decades ago. He told them, quote, "Look, there's a lot of things you understand instinctively, but your parents don't understand those things because they're just too trapped in old thinking," end quote. Do these men truly believe in what they're saying? Do they honestly believe that the environment can really be saved through government intervention, or is the environment just a vehicle towards the progressive ideal of total government rule? Like Gore, Roosevelt didn't just use words. He demanded action. He limited personal freedom and ignored states' rights by giving government more power over water and grazing rights, creating over 50 bird preserves through executive order, and with a stroke of a pen, establishing more than 20 national forests. It didn't matter to him that businesses, individuals, and states were negatively impacted by each of these decisions, or that their rights to those previously public areas were taken away. Roosevelt argued that, as he put it, quote, "the greatest good for the greatest number," end quote, required such action. The new nationalism, he said, quote, "puts the national need before sectional or personal advantage," end quote. We hear the same arguments today. Politicians lecture us that jobs must be sacrificed and factories closed for the sake of the greater good. We're told that we can't drill for oil, develop nuclear power, or burn clean coal because of the environmental impacts. We're told by our president, quote, "we can't drive our SUVs and eat as much as we want and keep our homes on 72 degrees at all times," end quote. Words that eerily echo Teddy Roosevelt's calls for a new spirit of service and a new spirit of sacrifice, quoting, "where each of us resolves to pitch in and work harder and look after not only ourselves, but each other," end quote. In the 1970s, progressives used global cooling as their call to action. That call included, naturally, increased government control. In the 1980s, as science refuted claims of global cooling, progressives argued for more government power and control to fight global warming instead. Today, desperate to explain long periods of cooler temperatures, increased ice formations at the southern polar cap, and other inconvenient global warming truths, progressives now tell us that government must have the power, resources, and money to fight climate change, whichever direction that change might be. We are told that humans are destroying the planet, and that only scientists, the experts, or the very rich, the very famous, or very powerful can save it. I guess maybe those people are so busy flying on their private jets, attending international climate conferences, and accusing us of poisoning the planet that they either don't notice their hypocrisy or they accept it as the price for the great work that they're supposedly doing. We don't trust the political class because they no longer find shame in their own hypocrisy. As always, the hypocrisy is loudest in Washington. In 2007, Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi announced with great fanfare that Congress, quote, was going green, end quote, by replacing 12,000 incandescent light bulbs with environmentally friendly compact fluorescent ones. Trees would also be planted and carbon offsets purchased. What you didn't see in her press conference was the carbon-belching Capital Power Plant that burns more than 17,000 tons of coal each year. The plant's proud owner? None other than the United States Congress. Since Congress owns the power plant and Speaker Pelosi controls the House, isn't she ultimately responsible for the multiple Clean Air Act violations that the plant has been cited for? Congress apparently felt it could operate the power plant guilt-free because it purchased close to $90,000 worth of carbon credits. Those credits allow an entity to emit carbon in exchange for paying another entity to offset that carbon by planting trees or sequestering CO2, thereby eliminating or reducing the same amount of carbon. This year, Nancy Pelosi's much-heralded plans for carbon-neutral, guilt-free Congress died an unceremonious death. Congress will no longer purchase carbon credits. No reason was given for the change, but perhaps Congress was embarrassed by the revelation that several of the companies hired to offset their gluttony had already reduced their carbon outputs long before they were contracted by Congress to do so. In other words, if you give somebody $1,000 to plant 10 trees, but later found out that they planted those trees 5 years ago, have you really done anything to help the environment, or are you just helping your own conscience? In the case of Congress, it was definitely the latter. Common sense tells us that the simpletons running our government should have learned from their own failed 2-year experiment with carbon credits that the system doesn't work. But instead, they've come to a different conclusion. They've decided that while they will no longer purchase carbon credits, American businesses and corporations must start to. In the same month that they abandoned carbon credits, Congress introduced a 648-page bill that could effectively impose the carbon credit scheme on every American business. Yet, in all of those pages, 2 simple questions are not answered. Who will be taxed? And how will the money that is raised in what one politician called the most significant revenue-generating proposal of our time be spent? What was included in the bill were explicit details of every new efficiency standard, such as protocols for putting on a slanted roof that could require fiberglass asphalt shingle roofing. There were also 10 pages discussing portable lighting, including a section on artwork lighting fixtures, and another section spelling out the details of standby power needs for hot tubs. The hubris, arrogance, and hypocrisy of politicians has no limits. They seek to impose laws on us that they themselves cannot tolerate. It's a return to the do as I say and not as I do mentality, and it is taking us down a subtle road to tyranny.